Tensions in the Middle East, they are escalating sharply following U.S.-Israeli strikes on Iran and Tehran's retaliation. South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa has sounded the alarm, condemning it as violations of international law, the attack on Iran, and rejecting the doctrine of anticipatory self-defense as has been used. Meanwhile, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has warned that the region risks sliding into a wider war. So, are we witnessing another regional flare-up or a deeper fracture in the global order? This is the question that we are asking today. For more on this, we are joined by Nader Hashemi, Director of the Center for Middle East Studies and Associate Professor of Middle East and Islamic Politics at the University of Denver's Joseph Corbell School of International Studies. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us, Professor.
Thanks for the invitation. Just a quick correction. I'm no longer at the University of Denver. I teach at Georgetown.
Apologies for that. So just your thoughts on what we're seeing, as I mentioned before, that there has been various actions from all quarters of the globe. How do you view these developments?
Well, they're clearly a transformative moment in the politics of the Middle East, with long-standing repercussions, not just for the people of the region, but specifically the people of Iran, who are going to bear the brunt of this brutal, illegal, and immoral war. And of course, the global economy is going to be rattled, as we're seeing right now, in terms of the aftershocks. They're going to affect many people in distant lands because of this war that is currently taking place. So we're still in the early days. I can't say I'm surprised that it has happened. This has very much been a long-standing, I think, plan that war hawks in the United States and in Israel have wanted to unleash on Iran. And now we're seeing them now they have the opportunity to do so. And the sad sort of, reality that we're facing is there's no one that can really stop them. No one in Europe, no one in other parts of the world, and no one in the global south.
And it's interesting that you should say that, because South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa says that what is happening is anticipatory self-defense, and it should be rejected as per Article 51 of the UN Charter. So in plain terms, does Pretoria believe that these strikes are unlawful? You've said so, there's some who have said so, but from the attacker's point of view, is there justification?
There's absolutely no justification. The UN Charter is crystal clear that what the United States and Israel is doing right now is a clear act of aggression. People were prosecuted for this at war crimes tribunals for the act of aggression. Let's not forget that in the middle of negotiations, not for the first time, but for the second time, I want to emphasize, for the second time, the U.S. and Israel decided to bomb Iran, when Iran had effectively, again for the second time, agreed to give up its nuclear program and put it under international inspection. We are at this moment of crisis specifically and precisely because Donald Trump, after being encouraged repeatedly by Benjamin Netanyahu, tore up and threw into the dustbin the Iran nuclear agreement that was negotiated in 2015 and had the sanction of a UN Security Council resolution. Most of the world celebrated at the time, including many Iranian internal democratic forces, because they saw this was the end of an era and a political opening. And that set the stage for where we are today. So there's no justification. There's no way this can be sort of squared with the basic principles of international law. And the Trump administration knows that, because they're not trying to justify their attack against Iran within the framework of international law. They're trying to use other arguments, none of them, by the way, that stand up to critical scrutiny.
And you spoke about the previous agreement, especially nuclear agreement, that you say, and certainly that's what Iran has said, that it blames US President Donald Trump for where it is. But we're also hearing from Oman's foreign minister, who's come out saying that he actually doesn't understand what is going on, because even in the talks prior to the attack, that Iran had pretty much agreed to a lot of the dictates of the United United States. So is this international law being rewritten, as you say, at the purview of Israel? Because there are those who say what Donald Trump is basically doing is, entertaining the flights of fancy of Benjamin Netanyahu, and that is of regime change in Iran. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't think this is being done exclusively because Netanyahu is, calling the shots here. For a very long time, not just the United States and Israel, but many Western countries, Canada, Australia, and Europe, have viewed Iran as the biggest source of instability in the Middle East. And they blamed Iran for all of the regional troubles. I think that's a gross distortion. Iran has contributed to regional destabilization, but so have many other countries, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and critically Israel in terms of its genocide against the people in Gaza. But the view in the West is that anyone who stands up against and opposes Western interests in the region, whether those are Israeli interests or the interest of Arab dictatorships that the West supports, that political entity needs to be stopped and crushed. And so there's a view right now in the United States, again, with a lot of sympathy in Western capitals, but this is the time to solve once and for all the quote unquote Iran problem. Because at this moment, Iran is weak economically. Politically, its people have abandoned the regime. There's been large-scale protests. And then Iran's regional alliances have shattered. And so there's a sense in the United States, again, with encouragement from Western countries, that if they can attack Iran through some sort of military operation, on the other side of this war, Western interests and Western allies in the region will be more secure. So this is much more than simply, Benjamin Netanyahu calling the shots. This is a long-standing Western policy that is deeply antagonistic toward Iran, primarily because Iran is an independent player in the politics of the Middle East. And when I say independent, I mean two things. I mean, it doesn't work within the orbit of Western geostrategic concerns, and it doesn't have any allies. But also, when I say independent, I don't necessarily mean that Iran is a good player in the Middle East. It's a deeply repressive regime that brutalizes its own people, as we saw last January, where it killed thousands of protesters. But from a Western geostrategic perspective, human rights and the rights of the people of Iran are just rhetorical talking points. What really is driving this policy is an attempt to establish further Western hegemony. Anyone who stands up to the West will get clobbered. And that's really why Iran has been subjected to this type of brutal punishment.
We've seen Iran retaliate. Reports are suggesting that it's sent missiles, other ammunitions, and bombed about 14 countries, including several deaths being reported. So are we seeing real battlefield developments here? And what the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres warning of the erosion of multilateralism, especially given the fact that the UN Security Council itself remains divided along the veto lines?
No, that's all true. Look, the United States for a very long time has sort of had it two ways. They would invoke the principles of international law and a rules-based order when it suited them, but they would ignore it when it didn't suit them. And we see this very clearly in the context of what happened in Ukraine when Russia invaded Ukraine. All of a sudden, Western statesmen found their inner sort of resolve and started to reacquaint themselves with the UN Charter, and they criticized Vladimir Putin, rightly, for violating the UN Charter and engaging in an act of aggression. But when one of the key allies of the United States in the Middle East, in this case Israel, engaged in a certifiable genocide against the Palestinian people, the reaction from the West was not only to condemn it, but was actually to arm the Israeli defense forces as it was prosecuting this crime of genocide. And now in the context of Iran, we're seeing a very similar equation happen again. I'm Canadian by birth, and so I was reading the statement of Mark Carney, Canada's Prime Minister. He's effectively acting as a cheerleader for Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu. And this is the same Mark Carney who 2 months ago at the Davos Economic Summit was talking about the importance of a rules-based order, lamenting that world is slowly passing and that Donald Trump is moving us in a different direction. He's done a 180-degree turnabout and now is, undermining his own credibility, but effectively, supporting this war of aggression. And so, that's nothing really new to us. Those of us who study the politics of great powers, there's always been this double standard, but now it's so blazing and blatant. And there's almost sort of if you listen closely to what some of, Trump supporters are saying, they're almost bragging about it. They're very, very happy, thinking that this is going to create a better world for everyone. It's going to be a disaster, as we're seeing right now in the Middle East.
A better world, or a bigger war, as has been hinted by some. And I want to look at those fractured global responses, as you say. You speak about Canada's Prime Minister. We're hearing the same about what is happening in the UK, Keir Starmer, and we're hearing reports suggesting that France may actually join in and support the US and Israel in its response. But, on the flip side, we're seeing Russia and China condemn the strikes as unlawful. And other European powers are urging restraint, but they also stop short of outright condemnation. So where is this fractured response going to lead to? Expose a deeper crisis where there is a so-called rules-based order, but still lead to a wider scale war?
It's going to lead to a wider scale war because there's an asymmetry in power between Iran and its adversaries, the United States and Israel, and Europe is effectively backing the United States and Israel. You mentioned that France might join in. Keir Starmer has allowed British military bases to be used in the attack on Iran. And China and Russia really don't have a dog in their fight. They're simply going to spin this to gain sort of polemical arguments, advanced polemical arguments to expose the hypocrisy of the West. But they're not going to get involved in any serious way in terms of mediation or even supporting Iran that could tip the balance of power. So they're effectively irrelevant in this story. And then, unfortunately, most of the regional countries in the Middle East, and I want to emphasize that, not just in the Middle East, but in the larger Islamic world, they're effectively sympathetic to the American and Israeli attack because they're all dictatorships. The people have no voice. And we've seen this manifest itself in Donald Trump's horrific colonization plan for Gaza, where all of the leading Arab and Muslim states effectively lined up to support Donald Trump and back his horrific peace plan in Gaza, including, for example, Indonesia, which is sending 8,000 troops to effectively enforce the Netanyahu-Trump plan for Gaza. So the world is in a state of disarray. We have very few good moral voices. Norway, I would argue, has taken a very principled stand. I would compare and contrast Norway's response to this war with that of Canada or England. Your president, President Ramaphosa, has been saying good things. I think we need more voices, at least to sort of draw a moral distinction between those countries that have torn up the rules-based order and those countries who still at least adhere to it. So I think that's the best that we can expect at this time. Unfortunately, countries like South Africa or Brazil or Norway, they don't have a lot of clout politically and militarily to shape the outcome of this war. But at least they can speak out about it. They can expose this gross hypocrisy. And so their statements are very much welcome.
You spoke about the polemic divide. Now we're seeing reports out of Saudi Arabia saying that the U.S. is actually abandoning its allies and it's instead redirecting those resources to protect Israel. So countries which the US has military bases, according to Saudi Arabia, are suffering because of the Iranian airstrikes. So is it a tactical move? Is it a well thought out move? I'm just trying to understand what does it mean, because people are saying let's de-escalate. The UN Security Council, even President Ramaphosa is saying that let's focus on de-escalation. What would that look like, given what Saudi Arabia is saying?
Well, de-escalation would look like trying to talk Donald Trump back from prosecuting this war. Here, Benjamin Netanyahu is irrelevant. If Trump calls him up, as he has done in the past, and say, cut it out, because Israel is the junior partner, they will follow the American lead. But the problem is here we're dealing with a government in the United States run by a group of people who are not serious politicians or actors. In fact, in many ways, objectively speaking, they're sort of clowns. They have no serious commitment to international law, to a rules-based order, even to, I would argue, the best interests of the American people. They're deeply sort of informed and guided by a narrow set of interests that are shaped by domestic lobby groups and critically by Donald Trump's own personal family ambitions that revolve around his, people who support his campaign and various dictatorships and monarchies that have a lot of money. So this is, I think, what we're facing here. Unfortunately, we're in a situation where the most powerful country in the world is now run by very unprofessional, in fact, I would argue, politically deranged characters who act like they're, running a mafia organization. But the sad tragedy is they're running the most powerful country in the world with a lot of military muscle. And we're seeing this all come together in this horrific war that's being unleashed right now in the Middle East.
Mm. You mentioned the economic shockwaves earlier on. There are already warnings about this being a global economic front. We've seen airports shut down, flights being cancelled, but I'd imagine energy markets are the ones that people are going to pay greater attention to, oil production, etc. How bad can it get?
Well, Donald Trump just said a moment ago that he is planning a long-term war. And so we've already seen the price of energy and petroleum gas go up. I think the more the war lasts, the more the global economy will be affected. But critically, ruling elites, people in with extensive wealth, they won't be affected. It'll be the average person. It'll be poor people who will bear the brunt of rising energy costs, particularly poorer countries, which is why I think Donald Trump doesn't really care that there's going to be a shock to the global economy. So yes, it could get much worse. The Straits of Hormuz in the Persian Gulf is where 20% of the world's oil passes through. That effectively has been shut down because of this war. And it's an open question when Donald Trump will recalculate. I think one thing that would force his recalculation is if you see rising casualty numbers on the American side. That would then force in the United States greater domestic opposition. In the United States, where I'm speaking to you from, nationally, this war against Iran has roughly 22% support at best. Within Donald Trump's own base of supporters, the MAGA movement, there's a lot of discontent toward, American military expeditions abroad, forever wars, as they're called. Donald Trump, in fact, campaigned on that slogan. And now he's, once again, to no one's surprise, done a 180-degree turn on his campaign promises. So the longer this war drags on, Donald Trump does pay a domestic price. And that's, I think, perhaps where he's most vulnerable.
And I want to then bring to you, okay, actually, before we go to that, the issue about shipping lanes also being exposed. We saw a massive domino effect in terms of global markets with supply chains when the war with Ukraine and Russia was pretty much at the very beginning point. A couple of years later, it seems like people are getting sort of used to the impact of that war. How much more can this exacerbate the economic instability force that, and will it force these powers who are involved back to the negotiation table?
No one knows for certain. Let me just cite one personal story. So this morning I was on a call with a friend of mine in England who said that gas prices have skyrocketed within 24 hours by 50%, because most of the gas that, at least at this time, England was importing was coming from Qatar. That's no longer possible. 50% increase. So that affects the pocketbook. That affects the daily expenses of every single family in the United Kingdom. And I suspect this is going to reproduce itself around the world the longer this war drags on. So yes, the ripple effects, the cost, the pain and the suffering, again, I want to emphasize on the poor segments of society are going to be felt very dramatically. Ruling elites around the world in different countries will not bear the brunt of this crisis in the global economy that's just beginning to manifest itself. And so we are in very dire straits.
Now, I want to look at who, if at all, has the moral authority to get the parties to stand down. The role of the global south, as in the broader global south, do they actually have what it takes to exert a diplomacy that would expose the fragmentation but also bring the parties together into a more sober decision making?
Look, I don't think there's a chance of negotiations here because Donald Trump, if you follow what he was asking at the last round of negotiations in Geneva, he wasn't seriously negotiating with Iran, even though, as you indicated, according to the Omani foreign minister, Iran had effectively made major concessions. The Omani foreign minister said there was, in fact, a breakthrough because Iran was willing to give up its stockpile of nuclear material that it had produced, enriched uranium. What Donald Trump was interested in was complete Iranian surrender. And Iran isn't going to do that. It's willing to go to war rather than completely prostrate before the feet of Donald Trump. And so Donald Trump miscalculated because he thought he could do to Iran what he did to Venezuela. But Iran is not Venezuela. It's a much tougher adversary. And then that raises the question that you just asked, who could be the mediator, the interlocutor here? So Oman has no clout. It's a small country. It's very dependent on the United States and the West for its security protection. China and Russia don't really have a stake in this conflict. The Arab states, who are also feeling the pain of this war, because a country like Dubai, which was known as the safe haven where people could visit and have a good time and be safe, their entire economic planning model and their reputation, which was predicated on stability, has now gone out the window. So perhaps at some point they will impose or call Donald Trump and say, look, we've got to put this to an end. But who knows? Donald Trump, as I said a moment ago, is completely an unpredictable player. In fact, at some level, he's deeply irrational. He's surrounded by yes men. He's surrounded by pro-Israel war hawks and fanatic members of his own MAGA movement who shape his worldview, people like Senator Ted Cruz and Senator Lindsey Graham. And so we don't know how this is going to come to an end. I think that's one of the, deep concerns that I have. It doesn't seem like anyone has the influence and the clout to stand up to Donald Trump. In many ways, the international community is fearful that if you antagonize Donald Trump, he's going to wake up and impose tariffs on a particular country. And so this is just, we're living in a world that's best characterized as the Wild West, as a completely anarchic world where rules have been thrown out the window. And in those countries that at least claim to stand up to a rule-based order, countries like Canada, countries like the UK, countries like Australia, all of them are effectively cheerleaders for Donald Trump's war campaign. So that's why it's such a dark and depressing moment, because it doesn't seem like there's going to be an off-ramp. At least if there is, I can't see it.
So the big question then is, who stands to benefit? Because one wonders what will be the nuclear implications of this. Will it strengthen hardliners? Will it weaken those against non-proliferation? But also, there are those who've been saying, this was part of Donald Trump's plan all along. He wanted to rile up Iranians about just how bad the economic situation is and force regime change. Was this really the response that he was looking for? Any of these fair comment?
Yeah, that's a good question. And this is going to have to be my last answer because I've got to go to another interview. But I think who benefits? Great question. I think Israel benefits because its regional adversary has been clobbered and weakened. And I think that's very much, the goal here, to try and weaken Israel's primary adversary by destroying its military capabilities, preventing it from projecting power abroad, thus allowing Israeli policy to dominate the region. So they benefit. I think war hawks and other people who are ideologically aligned with Israel in the United States benefit because they think this is going to lead to a better Middle East. Ironically, on the other side of the equation, the Iranian regime, the Islamic Republic of Iran, benefits because they're now able to produce a narrative where they're the victim of international and regional and global aggression from the West. And at a precise moment when the regime was suffering from a huge crisis of legitimacy where this regime has presided over recently a horrific massacre of thousands of its own citizens. And now the narrative is starting to change in Iran as people are seeing the images of this devastating war that's being unleashed on Iran, now killing, according to the last time I checked, as of this morning, 550 Iranian citizens, with probably more still under the rubble. So this is going to strengthen and embolden the Islamic Republic of Iran. That often happens when a country is subject to external aggression. People rally around the flag. And it's going to, sadly, I think, come at the detriment of the wishes of the Iranian people, who do have democratic aspirations and who really have been abandoned by the international community. All of this talk that we hear from Donald Trump, where he wants to sort of support the Iranian people, I think is completely fabricated.
Prof, I want to thank you for your time, really, and your insights. Much appreciated. Nader Hashemi, a professor in the International Relations Department at Georgetown University, just speaking to us about what is happening in the Middle East, the impact on the countries surrounding Iran, which is being attacked by Israel and the United States. And of course, reports saying that Iran itself is bombarding allies of the United States. And there are various reports on the casualties, either in terms of the death toll or the countries that have been hit themselves. We will continue to bring you more details of this as and when we get that information.
Across Africa, communities rise with the promise of clean water and clean sanitation. The African Union's 2026 theme calls us to action.
It's about mobilizing real commitments, securing climate-resilient water and sanitation projects, and ensuring that water becomes a driver of sustainable development and prosperity across the continent.
A landmark moment, not only for Africa, but for the global